if Mark Carney is outside of Canada and his bills end up coming to any of the votes, they could potentially lose those votes. And this is the problem with a fragile majority. How could he lose those votes despite them having 172 seats, which is the majority, even with the speaker voting with them? Like this. Ladies and gentlemen, we have breaking news. With the 3 by-elections potentially giving Mark Carney a fragile majority, sources are now saying he's considering prorogation of Parliament if he gets it. Meanwhile, Liberal ministers insist there are no such plans to prorogue Parliament. So why would Mark Carney hit reset on Parliament, and for how long? Let's take a look. From the National Post, government says it will not prorogue Parliament if Liberals sweep April 13th by-elections. Move would give the party control of the House of Commons committees and allow it to push through legislation more easily. The Liberal government is considering proroguing Parliament to gain control of House of Commons committees and more easily push through legislation if the party wins all of the 3 by-elections taking place on April 13th, 2 Liberal Party sources say. Isn't that kind of funny, the headline being contradicted by the first paragraph? Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has been navigating a difficult minority parliament that has limited its ability to control committee agendas and passage of legislation. That's the entire point of minority parliaments. Membership on committees is decided by the number of seats each party has in the Commons after a general election. In a minority parliament, the Liberals can be outvoted on committees by a combination of Conservatives and Bloc Québécois, and legislation can be delayed for months, as happened with the government's budget implementation bill. The Prime Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff, Braden Cayley, said there were no plans to prorogue Parliament after the by-elections, saying Mr. Carney is, quote-unquote, laser-focused on fast action across all of government to build our economy strong. In a statement Tuesday, Government House Leader Steve McKinnon also said Ottawa won't prorogue as, quote, we work towards a spring economic update that builds a stronger, more independent, more competitive Canadian economy, end quote. A Liberal sweep of all 3 ridings would bring the party seat count to 173 in the 343-seat House of Commons, which is 1 more than a bare majority. This would prevent the opposition from defeating the government in a confidence vote. But even with a majority, in order to restructure Commons committees, the government would still likely need to turn to prorogation, a procedure that ends the current session of Parliament and releases MPs from their parliamentary duties, including committee appointments. If the Liberals win the 3 by-elections, the sources said, one option being looked at carefully is for the government to have a short prorogation, come back with a new throne speech, and revamp the committee system. Another option is to prorogue in September, the sources said. The Globe and Mail is not naming the 2 sources because they were not authorized to discuss the matter publicly. A third source said the government could also try to change the standing orders on committee membership without prorogation. But the government official said the Conservatives and Bloc would likely put up a political fight and mount a filibuster to keep the current committee standings that were set after the general election last April. The Globe is not naming the official, who did not want to publicly discuss the government's parliamentary strategy before the April 13th vote. Reordering the party standings on committees without prorogation would require a motion approved by the House of Commons. In order to win such a vote, the Liberals would need 173 votes, 1 more than a bare majority. If the Liberals only have 172 seats following the by-elections, such a motion could result in a tie, in which case the Speaker, by tradition, is required to vote in favor of the status quo, and it would not be approved. So, what does that mean? Okay. So, as we all know, prorogation is a tool that prime ministers sometimes use that traditionally resets the agenda in Parliament. And this sometimes takes place after major global events, or the government has actually completed most of its mandate as a result of the last general election. So they may prorogue Parliament and then go to a throne speech where they set a new agenda for government to actually act on. Now, that's not the case in this case. So what is really going on here? Well, there's a couple of different ways that Mark Carney has to actually solve a problem. And the problem is, if he gets this majority, his problem is committee. See, after the general election, when Mark Carney had not a majority government, the committee numbers were determined based on the representation in the House. So the Conservatives had the vast majority of the opposition seats, followed by the Bloc, and the NDP didn't have party status, and neither does the Green. So you ended up with the Conservatives having a bunch of people in committee. You had the Bloc with one, and then that would outnumber the Liberals that are on those committee meetings. So this gives the opposition a lot of power in committees to hold the government to account in a minority government. But the minute you get to a majority, if those committees were rearranged, then the balance flips over to the Liberals because they have a majority government. So they would effectively have a majority in just about every committee. Now, what does this have to do with this discussion? Well, one school of thought is that in order to actually reset these committees to gain that majority in committees, to reflect the majority that's in the House, that the Liberals should just prorogue Parliament. That would dissolve all the committees, end all investigations, but it would also end all the bills, no matter whether they're in the Senate or the House. But with a majority government, what the Liberals would just have to do in order to bring back those bills is they could introduce a motion into the House to just revive all the bills in the order that they were, and that would be approved because they have a majority, and then all of the bills would come back to where they were in the House. Not necessarily in the Senate. In the Senate, that's different. That motion in the House doesn't apply to bills that are actively navigating the Senate. So, C9 is going to be discussed right now in the Senate. And if the prorogue, then C9 would die in the Senate. So what the Liberals would have to do is essentially bring it back to the point where it was in the House of Commons and then resend it to the Senate, and then it would start all over. The Senate doesn't have to adopt what the government wants them to adopt in terms of resuscitating all these bills and prorogation. So that's one thing. Now, why would they bother doing that? Well, it's cleaner. It's cleaner than the other way. So they don't actually have to prorogue in order to gain their majority in committees, but there's some very important things to consider. So when you're looking at gaining the majority in committee without prorogation, this is what you have to do. You would have to introduce a motion in the House to essentially redo the math on committee, and that would be approved if they have 173 votes. They need 173 though, because as this article says, if they only have 172, so if the Liberals lose Terrebonne, what ends up happening is the Speaker has to break a tie on every single vote, right? Because they only have 172, and the Speaker typically doesn't vote unless there's a tie. But when it comes to changing the standing orders, and changing the standing orders would also involve resetting committee, what's expected of the Speaker is to go with status quo. Meaning, status quo right now is there's a minority in committee. So the Speaker would be expected to vote with the opposition and keep the status quo. So that would be a big problem for Mark Carney. So this is why he needs the 173 in order to redo committee. Now, the problem, even if he does that, he has 173 and he introduces this motion and it passes. problem that he has is this. Here's a list of all of the committees in the House of Commons. Here's a list of all of the committees that are chaired by the opposition. Doesn't matter who it is, they are always chaired by the opposition. And this is so the opposition has the means to set the agenda in some of these committees to hold the government to account, no matter if it's a majority or a minority government. This is where the problem arises. So these are all of the studies that the Ethics Committee either have or are currently studying. So you have review the Conflict of Interest Act. People are asking us, why aren't the Conservatives doing anything about Mark Carney's conflicts of interest? Well, they are. They're actually actively studying this. You have committee business, which is normal, statutory review of the Lobbying Act, and other studies that you see here. So these are ongoing studies or completed studies by the Ethics Committee that are not too flattering to the Prime Minister or the Liberal government. So here's all the active studies in OGO, or the Government Operations and Estimates Committee. So you have the Postal Service in Canada's rural and remote communities, renewal of the parliamentary budget officer's mandate, the ArriveCAN application that was studied, and you go on. And here are the studies in the Public Accounts Committee. So you have the annual meeting, reports 5 to 7 of the Auditor General of Canada. This is where we learned of this massive immigration debacle and scandal report that caused the Conservatives to demand the resignation or the firing of Sean Fraser, Mark Miller, and the new minister, Minister Diab. Those investigations would continue unless he prorogues Parliament. If he prorogues Parliament, all of those investigations stop immediately. So it's cleaner for him to prorogue, but there's going to be backlash either way. So based on what the article is suggesting, it is saying that's why they're considering prorogation, because they can just say, well, you know, now we have a majority, so now we have a new mandate from Canadians, which you don't. You don't. You actually didn't get a new mandate from Canadians, and that's going to be the narrative from all of the opposition parties going forward. And you're also going to have all of the opposition parties jump up and down, rightfully so, and saying that Mark Carney secured his majority without a general election, and that he's securing a majority in committee through a parliamentary trick, despite it being in the rules. And Mark Carney is essentially ignoring the will of the people in the manner in which he's gone to get his majority and the manner in which he's trying to now get the upper hand in committee. All of it, which is true, none of it is tied to breaking the rules or anything. But it is frustrating, and frankly, it just exposes the character of Mr. Carney nonetheless. So there's other considerations to take into account here, and some of them are quite humorous to me. So let's say Mark Carney gets his majority of 172. Let's say he loses Terrebonne, which is a real possibility. There's no leaning one way or the other as to where Terrebonne is going to go. So let's say he gets 172. That would still allow him to survive confidence votes, and that would still allow him to pass legislation. Maybe. Here's the problem. We all know that Mark Carney loves traveling around the world. He loves being outside of Canada, right? Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means this. If Mark Carney is outside of Canada and his bills end up coming to any of the votes, they could potentially lose those votes. And this is the problem with a fragile majority. How could he lose those votes despite them having 172 seats, which is the majority, even with the speaker voting with them? Like this. It actually comes down to this. So, the hybrid voting process. On January 25th, 2021, a motion was adopted by the House of Commons extending hybrid proceedings. So, what this is this is just a fact sheet that outlines how hybrid voting works. And hybrid voting is people voting in the House, but they're also voting remotely via their app. Why am I bringing this up? Well, there's a very special rule involved in this. House of Commons hybrid proceedings provide for simultaneous interpretation, closed captioning, streaming, and broadcasting. The new electronic voting system has been integrated in the technology already in place to support hybrid proceedings. In order to vote electronically, members must be in Canada and enrolled in the electronic voting system. So, for a prime minister that loves seemingly to be outside of Canada as much as possible, this is actually going to present a potential problem. Because if he's over in Europe, and if he's over in China, if he's anywhere outside of Canada, he can't vote. So then, if any of these potential motions or any of these bills or confidence votes occur while he's outside of the country, they only have 171 votes. And the speaker won't vote because the speaker or the votes wouldn't necessarily be in a tie. So this is where things get very interesting. So despite Mark Carney having his majority, he doesn't actually have a majority if he wants to keep traveling around the world. Now, some people might say, well, why can't they just change the rules? Remember what I said before. These are standing rules. And when it comes to the standing rules coming to a vote, the speaker is expected to always go with the status quo, meaning there's no reason for the speaker to vote to change the status quo, which means that those rules would most likely remain the same. And based on how Scarpaleggia has conducted himself as the Speaker of the House, I'm actually quite comfortable that he will continue that convention. He seems to be very, very invested in appearing as a nonpartisan speaker, to not be the news, as the previous speaker was, Mr. Fergus. And I think he continues to go with convention. So this is where things get very, very interesting as we move forward, especially if Mark Carney cannot get that turbine riding and only ends up with a 172-seat majority. It may prevent him from going gallivanting around the world, and maybe that saves us taxpayer money. But if he's insistent on that, he could lose a bunch of motions, and he could lose a bunch of votes on his legislation. And if he's not careful, he could actually lose the confidence of the House if he prioritizes being wined and dined by his world leader buddies than actually paying attention to what's going on in the House at home.